What I want to talk to you about today is shifting the frame of the poem and sort of enlarging and making more flexible your idea of what a poem can and cannot include. And I want to begin by showing you a kind of diagram which you'll see on your screen, which I would say is a model for the typical poem that one sees in American contemporary poetry. And you'll see that that these circles are concentric circles, and usually at the center of every poem in this particular model, this particular paradigm for what a poem is, at the very center of the poem is the first person singular autobiographical I. That we take for granted in a certain kind of way that a poem is an artifact that is essentially personal. And in fact, even more than that, we take for granted that a poem is about inner life, is about the world of feelings, and not about the world of facts, not about the world of information, not about the outer world, that not necessarily about bombing in Syria or a genetic breakthrough that's taking place in China, or a new technique for blood transfusions, that's being practiced. But all of that material is actually part of the world itself. And also, it's imaginatively rich. This idea that a poem takes place is entirely based on the interior of the speaker is a myth that we have been saddled as a part of our legacy from English Romanticism invented by Wordsworth and Keats and Samuel Taylor Coleridge, that the I, that the self of the poet is sufficient subject matter for the poem. That may be true, but it's not always true, and it's not the only truth, and it doesn't have to be true. The biggest thing to fight in your development as a poet, in many ways, is the habitual kinds of ruts that you get into with your presumptions about what a poem is and what the proper subject matter of a poem is. And one of the most habitual of all ruts is this autobiographical narrative of crisis and resolution, which is basically the template for the average contemporary American late 20th century, early 21st century poem. That it's about you, it's about me. Let me tell you about my inner life, and especially about my feelings. But what about facts? Why have we shut so many interesting, rich, and imaginatively fecund metaphors and facts out of our poems? So, typically, to look at this diagram, the self is the little seed at the center of the poem. Usually, family life is often the next circle out. The next circle out might be romantic life or sexual life. The next circle out might be psychological life. And then circle after circle after circle are things like nature or society or history or politics or race or money or economics or language or nationality or God or science. So, do we really think as poets that we are the center of the world? Do I really think that in the view of the world and in the view of the history of literature that that my I is the legitimate king or emperor in the picture of the universe that I want to present in my poems? Well, no. That's a very youthful, adolescent, kind of traumatized and perhaps even narcissistic, not to say romantic version of how a poem describes the world and represents consciousness itself. A rich consciousness includes many, many different kinds, many different layers and different kinds of information about the world. And a rich self does not constantly think that it is the center of the universe. So why shouldn't our poems represent things in a more diverse and perhaps surprising way. If we write the same poem over and over again, the autobiographical narrative of crisis and resolution, chances are our discoveries themselves are going to be repetitious and redundant. You've had this insight before. Why do you have to have it again? Maybe if you started with something else, maybe if you started with a little piece of economic material, as unlikely as that seems, maybe if you started with the ATM that is on the corner of Walnut and 51st Street, and the people who are standing in line there, maybe your poem would be more interesting. Maybe you would discover something about the self and find metaphors for family life, perhaps as considering family life as a kind of ATM from which you're constantly withdrawing emotional funds, and often finding that your funds are insufficient, because other members of your family have not put enough love into your bank account. Well, you see where this goes. That a metaphorically rich world, an imaginatively rich world, is actually constructed and facilitated by the wealth of information that lies outside the circle, the little tiny circle of the self that we make so big and so dilated in our poems. So shifting the frame in order to honor information and the interestingness of information. Here's another metaphor that you can think of the poem. If you think of the poem as a kind of laboratory, and in that laboratory you're going to combine different kinds of chemicals and molecular compounds that come from the world. If you think of it as a test tube or a Bunsen burner or a kind of terrarium, and you're adding a little of this and you're adding a little of this, you're adding something, maybe I'll say something that Picasso said about the color blue. Why shouldn't that be in my poem? And then you're adding something about how many people died in the Civil War, and how many people were, how many African American brigades there were fighting in the American South. And then you add something about how you had the most wonderful aunt, and you remember when she visited your family when you were 13, and she let you stay up late at night, and she taught you how to smoke cigarettes. And then you add something else. So you are a mad scientist in the laboratory of your poem, combining this chemical and that chemical. And how rich it is not to know what you're doing. In fact, to make a good poem, you have to not know what you're doing. And that's the kind of combinatory kind of attitude that you might assume with your poems that you don't do now. I'm going to read you a poem by Spencer Reese, and you'll be able to see it on your screen, and to sort of show you how a poet who does not foreground the self, the singular autobiographical self, what kinds of things he can get into the poem, and how they create an emotional and an imaginative atmosphere which is as rich as any poem by your standard autobiographical, sort of traumatized American romantic poet, psychologically oriented poet. Spencer Reese, in his first book called The Clerk's Tale, he wrote a series of poems called Florida Ghazals. They're written in couplets. I'm going to read one of them to you now. Down here, the sun clings to the earth, and there is no darkness. Down here, the silence of the sea and the silence of the swamp seep into our muscles. All night, Dolores labors between the sea grapes and the empty park. Our town prostitute, she listens for a long time. Her listening makes her strong. The teenage boy locks his door and combs the obscene magazine. His calloused left hand chops the gloss in waves. The silence of the naked ladies builds. The Cape Sable seaside sparrows' population dropped 25%. females are silent. Male calls are counted and multiplied by 16. This is how we track what cannot be seen. Juan escapes from our prison. He duct tapes Playboy magazines to his rib cage. With his glossy carapace, he vaults over the razor strips of the chain link fence. Igaz Moniz wins the lobotomies. I am a pioneer of silence, but the silencing of madness haunts me because it is unresolved. Okay, so this poet has combined all kinds of interesting materials. The weather in Florida, the silence at night of the swamp, a town prostitute, a teenage boy masturbating in his bedroom to pornographic images, the endangered species of a particular kind of sparrow, how the numbers of the sparrows are calculated by biologists. They listen to the males and they multiply it by 16. This is how we track what cannot be seen. That's what the poet says. That's the poet speaking. And when the poet speaks like that, although he seems to be talking about an endangered species of sparrow, we know that he's talking about the invisible life. He's talking about the psychological life that we can't see below the surface. And then he has a line about somebody who won the Nobel Prize in 1949 for lobotomies. And then he has a little story about a prisoner who escapes from prison by duct taping Playboy magazines to his ribcage. So we see a kinds of themes and images and atmospheres, metaphors for gender and silence and shame and the secret life of the self sort of emerging and rising to the surface. Even though the self of the speaker is far in the background and is not being aggressively, dominantly represented. This is a different way of building the poem. You could call it a mosaic structure, you could call it a constellation. I would call it shifting the frame so that the autobiographical first-person singular is not taking up all the screen time, is not holding court and pretending to be the center of the universe, when in fact the self is not the movies, although in our private narratives, the self, the I, the me, Tony, is kind of the movie star of the narrative, the psychological narrative. In fact, the world is richer and more complex, and the poem will be more richer and more complex and more dialectical if we allow more information. This is not a justification for randomness, and this does not mean that putting any kind of batch of interesting kinds of factoids that are taken out of the dictionary and lumping them all together makes a poem. In fact, that's not true. A poem is an integrated and shaped dramatic construct. But the thing is that the balance of that construct can be much more dynamic and intriguing and can require much more associative energy and intelligence and can have many more levels than we are necessarily allowing into the narratives of our poems. And so my advice to you as a practicing poet or as a reader is begin with a piece of economics. Begin with the economy of Venezuela, or begin with the discovery of the polio vaccine, or begin with what the president had for lunch, and start your poem from there. You'll find your way to the self. The self and the emotional life, the inner life, will not be excluded from a poem, but you will find your way into the self by a much more unusual and perhaps original and revelatory route than you usually do. So look at this diagram of how the poem can be structured, and start with money or economics or racial history or science or auto mechanics, and start with other characters than yourself, and then see what comes into the poem. And then in your editing, you will orchestrate and shape that information, and you'll discover perhaps that your imagination is more excited than it has been in some time, and that you're actually sort of giving the reader more interesting kinds and more various data than ordinarily one expects to find when picking up a magazine or a book and reading the standard American production of the autobiographical poem. Shift the frame. Shift the frame.